I am Rebecca from ChemKnits. Today we're gonna dye a non-superwash wool alpaca nylon blend yarn using fiber reactive dyes as acid dyes. Before we go and take a closer look at the yarn, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Patty French. Patty, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. The yarn we're going to be dyeing today is Bare Imagination yarn from Knit Picks. This yarn is 50% merino wool, 25% superfine alpaca, 25% nylon. It is a very lofty yarn. There's not a lot of twist in this 2-ply yarn, and it does have a good grip to it. So I imagine that it could do really well for color work, but it is so soft and squishy, and I'm very excited to dye it for Patty. It's been a while since I've used imagination. And as I say it, I can't help myself because I use my imagination all the time. No, but it's been a while since I've dyed this particular yarn base, and I don't remember how absorbent it is. Therefore, I decided to pre-soak it overnight so that way all the fibers could be really well saturated. I think the technique I want to do on this yarn will have some variation of tone and depth anyway, so if we did have some yarn that was a little bit drier, that wouldn't be a huge deal in the end. But an overnight pre-soak sometimes is just a great way to get started for the next day. And I did not add acid or anything to our yarn. It really is just tap water. And so I'll see you tomorrow. Normally, when I want to dye wool, alpaca, or other protein-based fibers, I use a class of dyes called acid dyes. These are dyes that when you add vinegar or citric acid to your yarn and you combine it all together with some heat, you can get brilliant colors. But the class of acid dyes can't be used to dye plant-based fibers like cotton and linen. To dye those fibers, you need a class of dyes called fiber reactive dyes, and you usually have a situation where you use them with soda ash to dye that yarn. But the fun thing about fiber reactive dyes is that you can also use them as acid dyes. When you have your fiber reactive Procyon dyes, you can set up your conditions such that you have acid with vinegar or citric acid. If you have a wool or protein-based yarn, you can use them exactly like you use acid dyes to create your colorways. This is something I haven't done that much. I don't have a massive collection of fiber reactive dyes, but you know who has a massive collection of them? Dharma. And I use their acid dye line. So this is what we're going to explore today. But even though I'm using these fiber reactive dyes as acid dyes, just remember that anything that is an acid dye can't necessarily be used as a fiber reactive dye. I'm sure there are some pigments that probably overlap between the two lines, but there are pigments that can only be used as acid dyes, and then pigments that we call the fiber reactive dyes that can also therefore be used as acid dyes. Basically, it comes down to it's a lot easier to dye wool and other protein-based fibers than it is to dye cotton. We're gonna set up our dye bath and get it ready to go before I go and pull the colors. I have labeled all of my acid dyes using a poster from Dharma that has swatches on it, and I don't have that with my fiber reactive dyes. Okay, there's no color in the water. Some yarns, sometimes the water can turn a little bit cloudy, which maybe happened on some other yarn I pre-soaked last night. So, I thought that is worth pointing out. Here I have 8 cups of water, and I'm gonna add 2, 3, 4 tablespoons of white vinegar. This is more acid than I typically use. I often start at a ratio of about 2 tablespoons of white vinegar per 8 cups of water. But we are dyeing non-superwash yarn today. Non-superwash yarn needs more acid, heat, and time for things to absorb. And also, alpaca blends tend to need more of those same components for the colors to bind as well. But we only have 200 grams of yarn in the pan, so we should be good to go. I just have to decide, I think I want a little bit more water. Okay, I'm bringing over 4 more cups of water with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar, bringing us a total of 12 cups of water. and 6 tablespoons of white vinegar. Okay, now we have more movement here. My plan is to apply the dry dye powders onto the yarn, work the colors through, let them spread, and just sort of see what happens and play with the color. Now, because I'm planning on dealing with dry dye powders today, I am going to want to have a yarn mop. This is a skein of Knit Picks Swish DK yarn. It's 100% superwash merino wool. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly wet it in some water. I'm not adding acid to it yet because I'm also going to be using this as the yarn mop for a project where I'm using the exact same colors but as fiber reactive dyes on a cotton linen blend. And that video may or may not be out yet, but I'm going to use the mop for both, and then once I'm done with everything here, I'll add this into the dye bath. At least that's my plan. Plans can change and evolve, so it's all good. So now I'm going to start heating things up. I'm going to have the heat on medium low. Right in this 4-inch deep full-size catering steam pan, I'm on top of 2 gas burners on my stove. I could cover things. Maybe we will eventually, but for now we're not going to. And while this slowly heats up, let's go take a look at the colors we're going to use today. The 2 colors we are going to use today are Dharma Trading Company's Fiber Reactive Dyes in Fire Red and Fuchsia Red. The fuchsia is more of a like magenta kind of primary color, I believe. And the fire red is more of a true red. I haven't played with fiber reactive dyes that much, so I haven't used either of these dyes a lot. But I'm very excited to play with them. One thing to be aware of with these steam pans as we start to see steam is I've got heat here and here. The corners are still pretty cool. So one thing you can do is sort of move the pan back and forth to help distribute some of that heat into the corners. And so there are still areas that are going to be a little bit warmer, which I think does make more of a difference on non-superwash yarn than it does on superwash. But this is something I hope to pay more attention to. And maybe I need to do an experiment where I set things up on low so the heat is really localized here and try to play with that heat gradient. I don't know. But now that we're warm, at least, I'm going to go put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves so we can start adding dye. All right, let's start with just a little bit of our fuchsia color. Well, maybe a lot of it. I'm going to kind of sprinkle it on in a little bit of a symmetrical but random type of pattern. I don't know if I'm going to leave a lot of white behind yet or not. Sort of depends on what the colors do and how they spread. But I'm going to come in with my spoon now and work these colors through a bit. There will be a time and place to play with fiber reactive dyes as speckles, and I think that that is not today necessarily. We could end up with some speckles on here, but given that it's a non-superwash yarn, ooh, we're less likely to. Okay, I saw, and look, there's the one right here. There are some blue specks in this. Whether that is a contamination from like another project that I dyed, or what? I don't know. Because I could imagine a circumstance where, actually I suppose it could have also been dye powder on my gloves, but I could imagine a circumstance where I had dye powder and I tried to wipe my hands, as I mentioned, on the yarn mop. But if I did that and did not sufficiently wipe things off of my hand, then we could end up introducing color into another container. Okay, as I come in with the spoon to work these reds through, you can see that they're definitely more red, but maybe everything's a little bit less pigmented than the pinks. That I don't know. Ooh, I see some yellows are coming out of the red. Because, yeah, I'm seeing like a little hint of yellow come out of there, which of course also makes me wonder
There's a tad bit of white left in here. I'm going to leave it for now. But the little bit of yellow makes me wonder if the pink in here is the same pigment. That I don't know. Ooh, but the pink seems to be striking pretty quickly. Okay, let me set a timer for 10 minutes.
There are two things I think it's really important for me to point out. One is that, let's not forget, this is non-superwash yarn. We're gonna want to be really careful when we move and manipulate it because we don't want it to felt. This is especially important because the fiber is a little bit grippy on itself and it has that halo. That means it's probably more prone to felting. So we'll just have to keep an eye out for that. The second thing I wanted to bring up is that when you're using fiber reactive dyes as acid dyes, they can exhaust completely, and you don't need to use that much pigment to get vibrant colors. However, when you're dyeing cotton, you're gonna need to use a lot more pigment than like what I'm used to using on wool to get a really saturated color, because not all of the dye is gonna react with the cotton. Some of it will react with the water and things like that. And so you need to use a lot more dye to get a similar intensity of color. Although now that I say that, maybe that's not true, because with my heat time vinegar, I feel like things were fairly similar. But from other cotton dyeing projects I've done, I've felt like I've needed to use a lot more pigment. And so this is something I'm still getting used to. What we're waiting for right now, and I'm gonna go reduce the heat to low, is just for these colors to exhaust or mostly exhaust on the yarn so we can flip the yarn over and add color to the other side. Here we are after just 3 minutes. I feel like some of our reds are looking a little bit light red, but I wanted to have this as a data point for when the timer goes off and we come back. It's been 10 minutes and I still feel variation in here. I might want to go a little heavier on the reds, but it does look like almost all of the color is in the yarn, which is fantastic. And so I'm gonna go ahead and flip. And we see, okay, there's a little bit of color left there. Ooh, we got great color penetration. We have enough water in here that should have been the case, but it's always nice to see how much or little white is left behind after you do an application. Okay, I'm gonna go put the respirator mask back on so we can apply color to the other side.
I'm gonna go for the fire red first this time. And I'm gonna go slightly heavier. I'm trying to stick on the areas that were more red the first time around. I know it's not gonna be perfect, but you'll notice I am going in a little bit heavier just to see if I can get this color to punch a little bit more. Okay. And I probably will go back in with it one more time without needing to flip the yarn again. I'm okay with there being some pastel areas and less saturated areas. But what I was starting to say is that when you are dyeing yarn, and especially if you are using a color that is not one that you use that often, sometimes you don't know how much of it you need to use. Like for example, when it comes to acid dyes, I know if I want to use ballerina pink, which can be a lovely bright pink, if I want that pink to be more than just a pastel, I'm gonna need to add a lot of it. Coming in with the fuchsia. And in contrast, if I'm using, say, deep magenta, I definitely do not need to use nearly as much of that color. And so that's something that you learn a little bit by experience, and the more you play with the color. And this is why I was excited when Patty wanted pink and red, and then a lab partner who wanted the linen cotton blend that I'm dyeing in the same colors also wanted pink and red. I was like, ooh, I have an opportunity to play with these same two colors using two very different techniques on different fiber contents. I will probably do a short of some kind where I show them off together. But the best way you can learn more about different colors is by playing with them. And to give you a feel of where our yarn mop is right now, there's not that much color on it because I've only gone into the dyes a handful of times. And so right now I feel okay. But you know what we're gonna do? And I think we're a tiny bit overexposed. That, I think, on camera is more true to what I'm seeing in person. I think I'm gonna set a timer for 10 minutes, and then I may add more color on the side without moving things around too much.
This is really, really pretty. Now, there is still some color. Okay, there is still some color in there. The movement I am doing is mostly because now we have a few lighter patches. Okay. Okay. But you know what? I'm gonna try to let things be. I think this is beautiful and I don't want to mess with it too much more. Now what I am gonna do is add some more acid just to help things out. And the other thing we're gonna do is something that I often do not do. And we are gonna cover it. I frequently do not bother doing this, but what covering it will do will trap some of that steam in on the yarn. Some of it will still escape and I can check on it occasionally, but we're gonna trap the steam in there and therefore trap the heat in there. So then we can get a little bit more even heat all over everything while still keeping things low. So I'm gonna set a timer for 20 minutes and then we'll come back. It's been 20 minutes since we covered it, which also means that it's been over 30 minutes since we last added color. I can reuse the foil, but we're a little crumpled because she fell in. Things are looking, ooh, good. I mean, if I move it, I see some color come out, but that is a pocket on the side at one point. A lot of the other spots I'm checking, except for the middle areas, the dye bath seems to be clear, which is great. So what I'm gonna do at this stage is I'm gonna turn off the heat and leave it. I am gonna leave this to cool slowly. Eventually I may remove it from where the burners are, but I don't want to manipulate this yarn too much while it is hot. I would rather do that when it is cooler. I have no idea if the variation in the color is showing up on camera. I totally see it in person. I will see you probably in a couple of hours once this is cooled, because then we can remove the yarn and wash it. As for our yarn mop, I think this is the last time we will see her in this video. And I don't know which video will come out first, but it was pretty fun to use the same mop for 2 projects. I wanted to let this cool completely, but I'm impatient. And I want to be able to dye some other things today. So what I'm gonna do is carefully remove it. I don't want to agitate this very much, but you can see that the dye bath is clear. I had just felt the bottom of the pan and knew that there was still some warmth there. All right, I am going to set this yarn aside, which is feeling very, very, like, subtly tonal. I'm gonna set this aside to cool. And now, all right, I'm turning the heat back on, but I'm not waiting for things to heat up before I bring over our yarn mop. And initially, you can see that there's a lot of separation of color. I expect some of these colors are gonna bleed. There was no acid in this yarn yet. There was also no soda ash or anything, even though there may have been a tiny bit on my fingertips. But you know what? Okay, the colors are starting to spread more. I was like, wow, things are really staying put, but I am helping. That it's hard to even call it back staining if, you know, it's this intentional and the colors were never set. I do see a few yellow speckles in here, which is fun. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and heat this for 30 minutes just to set this color. And then we'll come back to remove it. This is such a happy color. It feels mostly pink, obviously. But we still have some red notes in here too. I am so happy. And I want it to be noted that this did not stain my pan. The thing that stained my pan, you can see a little bit of yellow and pink over here, was fiber reactive dyes, but with soda ash. Using them as acid dyes does not seem to stain my equipment. But anyway, I'm gonna set this aside to cool along with our main color, and then this one I'll wash off camera, but let's wash our imagination. Let's super carefully wash our yarn. I'm gonna take a little bit of some dish soap. Oh, the cold water is cold. In January. Ooh. I like the little light patches. They have me happy. Now, when you're using a fiber reactive dye as an acid dye, it can still bleed. When you're using a fiber reactive dye with soda ash, there will be a lot of rinsing that you have to do to remove undissolved dye. There's like the tiniest bit of color. But whatever dye remains on the fabric is permanently attached. With acid dyes, you have a very strong interaction between the dye and the fibers, but it's not permanent. So therefore, I always recommend washing yarns dyed with acid dyes in cold water. And not just if it's non-superwash, just in general. But there we go, no color coming out. Oh, this is pretty. All right, I'm gonna go pop this in my spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we'll go look at the finished yarn. Here is our finished imagination yarn. And if you didn't know that I had used a red and a pink to dye this, you might think that I used like a coral and a pink, or a little bit of a yellow or orange and a pink. Because the sections that were supposed to be red definitely broke with a hint of some yellow. And therefore we're seeing some orange notes in here versus bright red. We'll look at the yarn mop closer in a moment, but in here we do feel some areas that feel true red versus light red, in addition to the pink. There is a little bit less contrast, or maybe more contrast between the colors on the superwash yarn, where things were able to strike a little bit faster than they did on our merino alpaca nylon blend. Now maybe what this means is that I can pump up the volume of some of these fiber reactive dyes. We did not have any bleeding when we went and washed this yarn, which means all the color absorbed, and I would say we're at like a medium amount of saturation. And that's the thing with playing with new to you pigments and colors, is that sometimes you don't know exactly how they're going to behave, how they may break, how they may shift when you play with things together, how they may spread when you're in an immersion dye bath. It's possible that if I had done this in a non-immersion way, things that felt red at first would feel red later on, a little bit more like the yarn mop felt originally before I immersed it in the immersion dye bath. Now, a lot of this isn't that big a deal because my goal was to play with a pink and red fiber reactive dye, to use them as acid dyes to dye up some yarn, and we created some beautiful yarn here. But if you really wanted that red, gosh, probably what I would do is after I had removed our imagination yarn from the dye bath, I would have mixed up some of that fire red dye in solution and applied it to the yarn directly to pump up the red in those areas and then steam set it. That is what my gut is telling me to do, because it would allow the color to be a little bit more concentrated in areas and not spread as much and therefore soften. But I love what we created today, and I hope you do too. The last thing I want to do before I go twist this up is just point out again how grippy this yarn is. It's not that it is felted because it pulls apart with ease. It's that the yarn has a bit of a halo and that has a tendency to grip to itself. which is beautiful, but again means it's a yarn you do want to be really gentle with because it could felt. Twist it up, you can really start to see more of that tonal variation between, and I'm going to butcher the names, our red and our pink. You can see it very clearly. It is gorgeously subtle, and I think could turn into something really wonderful. Patty French, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope that you like the way this yarn came out and that you're going to love turning it into something special. And if you at home want to learn more about how you can become a lab partner like Patty, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. I'll have it linked down in the video description. Patty, thank you again. I am just so happy. I feel like it didn't blend into all one color. And I do want to bring up that there is another time that I had a red and a pink that feel quite distinct in some applications, and then in other ones blend together a little bit. And that was with acid dyes. When I was using Jacquard acid dyes fluorescent red, and then either, I don't know if I was using Jacquard's fluorescent pink or Dharma's, they're the same pigment. But in that circumstance, a similar kind of spread happened when I was in a full immersion situation. And our red ended up looking more coral than as vibrant as it can be when it's used in certain techniques. And so it's very possible this red is like that too. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits. Please subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss a new video. I post at least twice a week, and you don't want to miss any of the fun. And as I mentioned, I do have my Etsy shop that is full of ready-to-ship yarn, and we have lots of special events and pre-orders and fun things, and so you should always go and check it out, so that way you can bring a part of ChemKnits home with you. Thank you so much for watching.